My name is Isabelle Morton. I'm 37 years old, and I never thought I'd learn I didn't matter. From my own parents. It happened on the day we gathered to hear the will. Everyone was there, smiling, sipping wine, pretending we were one big happy family. Then the lawyer opened the envelope. To Gloria Morton, he read. We leave the entirety of the Morton estate totaling $12 million. He paused, looked up, and then added, To Isabelle, we leave nothing. She should learn to make her own way. The room went silent. Gloria sat tall, chin raised like she'd just won a prize. My father stared at the floor. And my mother, she didn't even blink. I nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in my throat. Thank you, I said quietly. Now I know exactly where I stand. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, hit like, and if family betrayal hits home for you, subscribe for more real stories about what it means to break free from silence. You see, I wasn't surprised. Not really. The signs had always been there. Growing up, Gloria was the golden child. She had the big eyes, the perfect hair, the voice that melted dinner guests. She played violin at 6, won beauty pageants by 10, and spoke at her high school graduation like a princess giving a farewell speech. Me? I was the quiet one. I liked books, dirt, bugs, science kits. I was the girl who asked for a microscope instead of a dollhouse, who stayed up late reading about insects while everyone else watched TV. But I always believed that deep down my parents loved us both. Maybe differently, but equally. That illusion shattered when I turned 10. I remember the day like it just happened. It was my birthday. My mom had promised she'd bake my favorite chocolate cake with raspberry filling. I wore the red sweater my grandma gave me and waited in the living room for everyone to come. They never did. I walked into the backyard and found them all, my cousins, my aunts, my grandparents, gathered under the string lights. My dad was holding a camcorder. My mother clapped along. Gloria stood in the center of the patio, twirling in a lavender dress, performing a song from The Little Mermaid. There was no cake, no balloons with my name. No one even noticed I was there. That was the first time I realized I could disappear and no one would notice. And now, nearly 3 decades later, I sat in that grand old living room with its stained glass windows and velvet curtains and felt 10 years old again. Invisible. After the reading, people whispered and shuffled out. Gloria kissed guests on the cheek, basking in her victory. Dad poured himself another scotch. Mom stood by the fireplace like a marble statue. I looked around that house, that cold mansion filled with antiques and empty love, and thought, this isn't mine. It never was. I left without saying goodbye. But just as I reached the door, a hand caught my arm. It was Mr. Raymond, the family's lawyer for as long as I could remember. Isabelle, he said quietly. Do you have a moment? He handed me a small sealed envelope, yellowed edges, familiar handwriting. It's from your grandfather, he said. He asked me to give it to you after the reading, privately. My breath caught in my chest. Grandpa Harrison Morton, the only person in that family who ever saw me, really saw me. I clutched the envelope like it was a lifeline. Thank you, I whispered. That letter would change everything. But not yet. First, I needed to leave that house, that life, that family, at least the version of them that had erased me. I walked outside into the late afternoon sun. The wind was cool, but it didn't sting the way it used to. Maybe because something inside me had shifted. I didn't know what I'd do next, but I knew I'd never be invisible again. When I got back to my car, I just sat there with the envelope in my lap. It wasn't big or heavy, just paper. But somehow, it felt more substantial than everything I'd ever received from my parents combined. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, strong, slightly crooked near the end, like it had been written by someone tired but still trying to speak with clarity. To Isabelle, only when the house is no longer home. I didn't open it, not yet. Instead, I stared at the Morton house through the windshield, that massive Tudor mansion where I grew up, full of oil paintings, imported rugs, and cold stares. It always smelled like polished wood and quiet disappointment. I remembered standing in that foyer when I was 16, holding up my acceptance letter to a summer science program at Yale. My mom barely looked up from her crossword. Does it come with a scholarship? She asked. No, I said, but it's prestigious. Only 12 students in the country. She waved her hand. Then you'll have to figure it out. We already paid for Gloria's modeling camp this year. I ended up mowing lawns for most of that summer. And Gloria? She came back from her camp with a portfolio of headshots and a manager. That was the rhythm of my life in that house. My achievements were my burden. Gloria's were everyone's victory. I looked down at the envelope again. For a second, I imagined what my grandfather would say if he were still alive. He used to take me to his greenhouse out back, where he grew orchids and ran small experiments in soil enrichment. While everyone else dismissed me as odd, Grandpa Harrison called me inquisitive. "You see what others overlook," he once told me. "That's a gift, not a flaw." I hadn't heard words like that in years. I finally started the engine and drove away, but not toward home. Something in me needed air, distance, memory. I turned off the main road and headed for Rose Hill. It was a small town a few hours west of the city, where my grandparents used to have a modest farm. We spent a few summers there before my parents deemed it too remote and cut contact with them entirely. I hadn't been back since I was 11, but I remembered the wildflowers, the chipped white fence, the way my grandmother used to hum while snapping green beans on the porch. I didn't know what I was looking for. Closure, maybe, or just proof that something in my childhood had been real. The closer I got, the more vivid the memories became. The tire swing, the way the floorboards creaked in the upstairs hallway, the smell of old books in Grandpa's study. When I finally pulled into the long gravel driveway, the farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered, but warmer. There was smoke curling from the chimney, and then the screen door creaked open. She stood there in a faded apron, her silver hair pulled back, eyes sharp as ever. "Isabelle?" I stepped out of the car, stunned. "Grandma Margaret," I whispered. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she walked toward me, arms wide. No questions, no hesitation. She just pulled me in. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again," she said, her voice trembling. "They told me you moved, that you didn't want visitors," I said, pulling back to look at her. Her face darkened. "They told you that?" she asked, almost a whisper. I nodded. She let out a shaky breath, then looked me straight in the eye. "Your parents cut us off when you were 11. Said it was time you focused on real education and stopped playing in the dirt." I swallowed hard. "I wrote letters," she continued. "Every birthday, every Christmas, they were returned unopened. That's when the dam broke. All the years I thought they forgot me. All the silence that I blamed on her. It had all been a lie." "I thought you didn't want me?" I whispered. She shook her head fiercely. "No, sweetheart. They didn't want you to have anyone but them." I felt something crack open inside me. That was the moment I stopped blaming myself for being forgotten, because now I knew the truth. And nothing would be the same again. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on the guest bed in Grandma Margaret's house, listening to the old pipes groan with every change in water pressure, the floorboards creak like they still remembered my childhood footsteps. The house smelled like rosemary and lemon soap, the same way it always did. I hadn't felt this kind of quiet in years. Not the empty kind, but the honest kind. The kind that doesn't ask you to perform. I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope again. "To Isabelle, only when the house is no longer home." My grandfather's handwriting, still clear, still strong. My fingers hesitated on the flap. I think I was afraid that whatever was inside would change everything, and at the same time that it wouldn't change anything at all. But I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of thick ivory paper, handwritten, no fanfare, just this. "Isabelle, if you're reading this, then I imagine you've already been shown where you stand in that house. I've watched for years as you tried to earn love that should have been freely given, but you were never the problem. You were simply too different, and that scared them." I paused. The air felt still, like the house was holding its breath with me. "You have what they don't understand. Curiosity without vanity, ambition without need for applause. They saw a misfit. I saw a mirror of myself. That's why I built something for you. Not a gift, an opportunity. One I believe only you will know what to do with. Go back to the place where the world made sense. The lab is yours now. The key is where we always kept the cocoa tin." I stared at the page. The lab. I hadn't thought about that place in decades. When I was little, Grandpa Harrison used to sneak me into his old research lab at the back of the barn. He was a biologist, the kind that still believed in asking questions no one thought to ask. He'd let me hold samples, peer into microscopes, and scribble observations into a spiral notebook while he worked on soil studies and plant mutations. To me, it was a wonderland. To my mother, it was nonsense. Dirty science, she called it. Real science happens in universities, not barns. The lab had been off limits after Grandpa died. I was 13. My parents said it was being sold. I never got to say goodbye to it, but now it was mine. I folded the letter, heart pounding. The cocoa tin. Without even thinking, I got up, padded barefoot to the kitchen, and opened the high wooden cabinet above the stove. My fingers reached behind the dusty jars and cans until I felt something familiar. A round metal tin, blue and gold, faded around the edges. I popped it open. Inside was a single, heavy key and a tiny note wrapped around it. Science is not about answers. It's about asking the right questions. I stared at it for a long time. Maybe this wasn't about money, or recognition, or even revenge. Maybe this was about finally building something of my own, not for them, for me. I walked back to the guest room, holding the tin like a sacred relic. Tomorrow I'd go to the barn. Tomorrow I'd see what he left behind. But tonight, for the first time in years, I fell asleep not wondering why I wasn't enough. Instead, I wondered what I could become. The next morning, I woke up with purpose in my chest. It had been years since I felt like I was heading somewhere, not physically, but emotionally. Like I was walking towards something that was mine. Grandma Margaret had already been up for hours. I found her in the garden, kneeling in the damp soil, trimming back basil with the precision of a surgeon. She looked up and smiled. "You slept well?" "I did," I said. "Better than I have in months." She handed me a pair of gloves and motioned toward the tomato bed. "Help me with the roots," she said. "They get tangled if you don't pay attention." We worked side by side in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. After a while, I spoke. "Did you know Grandpa left me something?" Her hands didn't stop moving, but I saw the twitch in her mouth. "I had a feeling," she said. "He always said you'd be the one to carry on his real work, not the published papers or the conferences, the part no one else ever really understood." I looked toward the old barn in the distance, barely visible behind a line of elm trees. "Is the lab still there?" I asked. She nodded. "I haven't touched it. The lock's been rusted shut for years. No one ever asked about it. Not even your parents." I hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the night before. "Why did they cut you off?" She let out a quiet breath, sat back on her heels, and looked me dead in the eye. "Because we didn't agree with how they were raising you," she said. "Your grandfather and I told them they were suffocating your spirit, that they were too focused on appearances, that they treated Gloria like a trophy and you like a puzzle they couldn't solve." My stomach turned. "You tried to stop them?" "We did more than try. We fought, but your mother said we were interfering. Your father didn't say much. He never did, but he backed her up. The last time we spoke, you were 11. You just spent a week here, and we sent you home with a soil kit and a book on plant genetics." I remembered that book. I'd kept it hidden under my bed for years. "They said we were filling your head with nonsense," she continued. "Said you needed structure, not science. After that, they stopped taking our calls. Letters came back unopened." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. "All this time," I said softly. "I thought you forgot about me." She shook her head and her voice broke for the first time. "We never stopped loving you. Not for a second. But they made it impossible." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Then she stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave me a look I hadn't seen since I was a child. A look that said, "You're stronger than you think." "Go," she said. "He's waiting for you." The sun was climbing higher as I walked the narrow dirt path to the barn. Birds chirped overhead. The air smelled like grass and something old, memories maybe. The barn looked worn but sturdy, weathered like it had been holding secrets in its beams for decades. I reached the door. The padlock was still there, rusted but intact. I took out the key from the cocoa tin. It slid in with a little resistance, and with one firm turn, the lock gave way. The door creaked open. Dust danced in the air like spirits waking up. And just like that, I stepped into the past, into his world, and for the first time in my life, into something that felt entirely mine. The barn smelled like time, dust, old paper, iron, the faint trace of cedar oil like something trying to preserve what was left. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. The light changed instantly, Softer, warmer, almost golden through the narrow slats between the wood. Everything was still. My feet brushed against the old concrete floor, kicking up little clouds that glowed in the sunlight. And then I saw it. The lab. It wasn't like the ones you see in movies. There were no gleaming white surfaces or blinking machines. It was cluttered, chaotic, brilliant. A long workbench stretched along the far wall, lined with dusty glassware, soil trays, broken beakers, old notebooks stacked in uneven piles. There were faded photos pinned above the desk, some of my grandfather at conferences, others of plant samples with scribbled notes. One of them was of me, maybe 8 years old, wearing oversized goggles and holding a test tube like it was treasure. My throat tightened. He kept that photo. He kept it right in front of where he worked. I walked over, gently brushing dust from the counter, careful not to disturb anything. Every object felt sacred, familiar. Even after all this time, I remembered how he moved, methodical, curious, always humming to himself as he worked. Near the microscope, I found a leather-bound journal with his initials engraved on the corner, HM. The pages inside were covered in precise, looping handwriting, observations, soil analysis, experimental results, notes about crop resilience, fungal patterns, carbon absorption. But between the data were little sketches, leaves, root systems, even diagrams of irrigation networks drawn with care. I flipped to a folded page near the back. There was a small map of the property. A red X marked a spot near the orchard. Next to it he had written, Test Plot 4A, first sign of self-restoring soil behavior. Isabelle should see this. I stared at the line. He had plans for me. Even back then, he saw something I didn't even know I was becoming. I sat down on the wooden stool in front of the bench and let myself feel everything. The grief, the awe, the quiet joy of being remembered, not just as a child, but as a thinker. My hands traced the edge of the counter where I used to crush dried leaves with a mortar and pestle. I could still hear his voice, calm and full of delight. Science doesn't give you answers. It gives you better questions. It all came rushing back. I remembered one afternoon, summer maybe. I was bored and asked him why soil mattered. He walked me outside, took a handful of dark earth and crumbled it between his fingers. This, he said, is the beginning of everything. Without good soil, nothing grows, not crops, not trees, not people. And now, here I was, 37 years old, holding the key, literally and figuratively, to the only place that had ever made me feel like I belonged. This wasn't just nostalgia. It was an invitation, a challenge, to pick up where he left off. Not for fame, not for approval, but for truth, for healing. I stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out across the field beyond the barn. The land was quiet, untouched, waiting, and for the first time in a long time, so was I. Behind the microscope, tucked beneath a cracked petri dish, was something unexpected. A sealed envelope, thicker than the last one, yellowed at the corners but untouched by mice or mold. My name was written on the front in that same familiar scrawl. Isabelle, it read, for the day you return, not as a guest but as a keeper. My hands trembled as I slid my finger under the flap. Inside was a letter, longer than the last. I took a deep breath, sat down on the old stool again and began to read. My dearest Isabelle, if you're here, if you've truly returned, then I imagine life has shown you its edges. I wish I were sitting across from you, watching the wheels turn in your mind like they always did when you were little. You didn't just ask questions, you savored them. You turned them over like stones, looking for the soft side. You probably grew up wondering why no one seemed to see you, why silence followed you into every room while applause followed someone else. I saw it too. I saw the shrinking in your shoulders, the quiet courage in your eyes. I paused, blinking back tears. The silence in the barn had taken on a new weight. They wanted a reflection of themselves. You were something else entirely, something they couldn't control, and so they dismissed you. But I didn't. You were never invisible to me. This lab, this land, this work, it was never meant to die with me. It was meant to live through you, if you choose it, if your heart is ready. You won't find riches here, Isabelle. What you'll find is patience, purpose, and maybe, just maybe, a way to grow something that outlasts us all. Start with the soil. That's where every answer begins. I believe in you. I always have. Love, Grandpa. I folded the letter slowly and held it to my chest. No one had ever spoken to me like that, not even once. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the tear hit the back of my hand. It wasn't just sadness. It was recognition. After all these years, someone had seen me. Someone had believed in me, not because of what I could produce or how well I could perform, but because of who I was underneath all that. The truth was, I'd spent most of my life trying to earn love, trying to earn a seat at tables that were never built for me, and here was a man who left me a key, a letter, and an open door, not because I begged for it, but because he knew I'd come. I stood wiping my eyes with my sleeve and walked toward the far end of the lab. There was an old storage cabinet I remembered from childhood. Inside were jars of soil samples labeled with neat handwriting, tiny vials of seeds, hand-drawn charts, and an old microscope that still smelled faintly of ethanol and mint. I ran my fingers over the labels. Test plot 1A, compost layer trial, bacteria cycle incomplete. It was like he'd just stepped out for lunch and would be right back. But he wasn't coming back. It was my turn now. I didn't know what I would do yet. But I knew I'd start with the soil, because that's where everything grows. The next morning I rolled up my sleeves and opened every window in the barn. Sunlight streamed in like an invitation. The air was heavy with dust and thyme. I sneezed 3 times before I even picked up a broom. But it felt good. There's something oddly healing about cleaning a space that once held meaning. Like dusting off not just the shelves, but your own memory, your own identity. The old workbench was layered in a fine film of soil and ash, the kind that settles when something hasn't been touched in years but still refuses to be forgotten. I found Grandpa's old field journals, each one dated meticulously. Most of the ink had faded, but his diagrams were still sharp. Precise arrows pointing toward questions he never stopped asking. It took me hours to sort through the clutter. I wiped every jar, every glass slide, every stubborn layer of grime from the window panes. I was alone, truly alone. No one texted. No one called. There were no meetings to attend, no emails to answer, no one asking if I was coming to dinner or why I hadn't responded sooner. For the first time in a long time, I had complete silence, and at first it was terrifying. I didn't realize how much I had relied on distraction, on being busy, on proving I was worth the space I occupied. But as the hours passed, something began to shift. The silence became sacred. I found Grandpa's old coffee mug, chipped, faded words on the side. Science is not a belief, it's a process. I washed it, made tea, and sat on the porch of the barn staring out at the fields. The land was tired. You could see it in the way the grass grew patchy and the soil crusted over like old skin. But underneath, I imagined something waiting, something that hadn't given up. Neither had I. That night, I stayed in the lab until well past midnight. There was no electricity in the barn, but I lit a row of battery-powered lanterns I found in the cabinet. Their soft glow bounced off the glassware, casting shadows that made the place feel almost alive. I started cataloging the samples left behind. Grandpa's handwriting appeared on every label, like a quiet whisper guiding me through. Plot 4A slight nitrogen recovery, test batch, compost trial, fail, Isabelle's question fungal spread plus soil warmth. That last one stopped me cold. He had named an entire experiment after something I must have asked him as a child. I tried to remember what I had said, something about mushrooms growing faster when the soil was warmer. I'd asked if they liked the heat the same way we liked hot soup in the winter. I was 8. He remembered. And more than that, he thought it was worth testing. That one label made every insult, every dismissal, every forgotten birthday feel just a little less heavy. I was never a ghost in his eyes. I went back to the bench and opened a clean notebook. My hand hovered over the page. It had been years since I started something just for me. No client deadline, no performance review, no one watching. Just me and the soil. I wrote at the top, Restoration Trial 1 Soil Recovery through Natural Microbial Reintroduction. Not exactly poetry, but it was honest. I outlined a basic plan using what Grandpa left behind. I'd start with a single test plot near the orchard. Plot 4A, just like in his note. I'd take samples, track conditions, and apply low-intervention compost and bacteria to see what would come back. I wasn't sure what the end goal was, but that wasn't the point. The point was to begin. I closed the notebook and looked around the lab. Lantern light flickered gently across the shelves. Crickets sang outside. The air smelled like soil and old wood and something almost sweet. I wasn't fixed. I wasn't healed. But I wasn't invisible anymore. I had work to do. And it finally mattered. The days started falling into a rhythm. I'd wake early, make coffee in Grandpa's old percolator, then walk the short trail to the barn with a notebook tucked under my arm and dirt already on my hands. The silence was no longer intimidating. It became my companion, my witness. Each morning I collected soil from the test plot behind the orchard, plot 4A, and brought it into the lab. I tested pH levels, moisture content, microbial activity. At night, I'd study Grandpa's journals by lantern light, circling his notes in pencil, adding mine in the margins. It wasn't glamorous. No cameras, no applause, no emails saying, "Well done." But it was real. Still, as the first week passed, something inside me itched. It wasn't impatience. I've always had patience for process. It was something deeper. A sense that the work I was doing, while meaningful, was quiet. Too quiet. I thought back to those childhood days in this very barn. It hadn't just been about science. It had been about connection. Grandpa never made me feel small. He listened like what I had to say mattered, and because of that, I kept asking questions. Not for validation, for discovery. That afternoon, I sat on the bench just outside the barn, sipping cold tea and watching the wind ripple through the tall grass. I saw a group of kids riding their bikes down the gravel road near the edge of the property. 3 boys, 1 girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old. They looked at the barn as they passed. One of them pointed. I remembered what it was like to be that age, curious, eager, a little lost. I also remembered what it was like to not be invited into the places that mattered. That's when the idea hit me. Not a vision exactly, more like a seed. What if the lab wasn't just for me? What if I could reopen it, revive it? Not just to continue Grandpa's research, but to create a space for kids like I used to be? The kind who ask too many questions, the kind who don't fit, the kind who aren't being seen. I jotted the words down in my notebook without thinking. SparkLab. It felt right. Not flashy, not complicated, just honest, a place where sparks of curiosity could take root. I walked back into the lab, looked around at the dusty shelves and jars, and suddenly saw it not just as a relic, but as a beginning. The next morning, I drove into town. Rose Hill hadn't changed much. The diner still had plastic booths and sticky menus. The hardware store still sold everything from fertilizer to fishing line, and the community center still had that old corkboard full of flyers, lost dog notices, and hand-scrawled invitations to pancake breakfasts. I pinned a note on bright yellow paper. Free science workshop for curious kids, ages 9-13. Learn about soil, seeds, and how things grow. No grades, no pressure, just questions. I left my name and a prepaid phone number at the bottom. Then I waited. 3 days passed. Nothing. Then on the 4th, I got a voicemail. A woman with a soft voice. "Hi, this is Jennifer. I saw your flyer. I'm a foster parent to 2 boys. They're good kids, but they've been through a lot. I think they'd love something like this. Just don't expect them to talk much at first." Her message ended with a quiet thank you. That Friday, 5 kids showed up. 2 from foster care, 1 homeschooled, 1 who had just moved to town and didn't have any friends yet, and 1 girl whose mom said she just didn't click with school anymore. They were nervous, fidgety, avoiding eye contact, so I gave them goggles and let them touch things. Soil, slides, leaves under microscopes. I showed them how fungi connect underground like a conversation in the dirt. And something changed. Slowly the silence broke, not with shouting or cheers, but with questions, tiny ones. Why do roots always go down? Can dirt be alive? Why does it smell like rain before it rains? That night, I sat alone in the barn after they left, surrounded by scattered notebooks, smudged handprints on glassware, and the echo of laughter I hadn't heard in this place in decades. And I realized I'd just planted something more important than any seed, a beginning, for them. And maybe, finally, for me too. The barn didn't look like a classroom, and I didn't look like a teacher, but on a crisp Saturday morning, 5 kids returned, dragging their feet but carrying backpacks. That alone felt like a small miracle. I'd swept the floor again, cleared out the workbench, and laid out 5 name tags written in block letters. I didn't know if they'd wear them. They didn't. One of the boys, Kyle, about 10, had scabs on both elbows and refused to take off his hoodie. His brother, Marcus, was quieter, maybe 8, and stared at the shelves like everything inside might explode. Jenna, the homeschooled girl, had a journal already clutched to her chest. She didn't speak unless spoken to. Eli, the new kid, mumbled a hello and then climbed onto a stool like he'd done this 100 times. And then there was Lila. She was all elbows and opinions, and within 5 minutes she asked me if I was like a real scientist or just bored. I laughed and told her the truth. I'm not a teacher. I'm someone who loves asking questions. She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. But she stayed. We started simple. I gave them each a tray of soil, a magnifying glass, and one instruction: find something living. They blinked at me, unsure. Kyle poked his tray with a pencil. Dirt's not alive, I smiled. You sure? He shrugged. I leaned over and picked up a handful of the dark soil from my own tray, holding it close so they could see. This looks like nothing, but inside here, there are millions of microbes. Some are so small that a microscope barely catches them. They break things down, feed plants, connect roots. It's like a whole hidden city. Lila looked skeptical. Eli leaned in closer. Marcus spoke up for the first time. How do they breathe if they're under dirt? That question hung in the air like a spark. I walked to the microscope I'd set up and motioned for him to come over. He climbed onto the stool, put his eye to the lens, and gasped. I see something moving. Jenna was next. Then Kyle. Then the room shifted. They weren't students anymore. They were explorers. They started asking more questions. What are fungi made of? Why do leaves curl when they're dry? Can soil get tired? By the end of the morning, the name tags were crumpled on the floor, but the notebooks were full. Even Kyle wrote something down, though he wouldn't let anyone see. Before they left, I gave each of them a tiny seed in a paper envelope. It's a sunflower, I said. You don't have to plant it, but if you do, pay attention to what happens. Write it down, draw it, ask questions. They took the seeds like they were something sacred. Jenna lingered by the door. She looked back at the microscope one last time. Do you think it's okay if I come again? I smiled. I was hoping you would. After they left, I stood alone in the barn, the sunlight angling through the cracks in the wood, catching the dust in the air. The space was messier than before. Papers scattered, one chair knocked over, a bit of mud tracked in across the floor. But it felt alive, and so did I. That night I journaled like I hadn't in years. Not about loss, not about the past, but about potential, about how maybe healing doesn't come from being seen by the people who hurt you. Maybe it comes from seeing someone else, fully, for the first time. From creating something no one can take away. SparkLab wasn't a program. It was a promise. To them. And to the little girl I used to be. The one no one listened to. She finally had a place to speak. It started with a photo. Just a quick snapshot from a visiting volunteer, one of the local teachers who dropped by SparkLab on a whim. He snapped it while the kids were bent over petri dishes, their faces lit by the soft glow of a desk lamp. In the frame, Jenna is mid-question, her eyebrows scrunched in concentration. Kyle is leaning forward, pointing at something under the microscope. Lila's laughing, her hands covered in soil. The teacher posted it on his school's newsletter, and somehow it made its way to the Rose Hill Gazette. The headline was small. Old Barn Becomes Science Lab for Curious Kids. I didn't even know it had been published until the gas station clerk recognized me. You're the soil lady, right? He asked, ringing up my coffee. The one with the barn lab? My niece keeps talking about you. I smiled, half embarrassed, half stunned. Later that week, the Gazette called to ask if they could do a proper interview. I almost said no. Not because I was afraid of the attention, but because it felt strange. To be seen in public doing something that felt so personal. For most of my life, I'd worked in the shadows, quietly, efficiently, never asking for credit, always wondering if I belonged. But this wasn't about me. It was about the kids and the soil. So I said yes. The reporter, a young woman named Dana, showed up with a notepad and recorder, expecting a few quotes. She ended up staying for 2 hours. She watched the kids run experiments, name their seedlings, argue over whether mushrooms were closer to animals or plants. She sat with Marcus while he explained how worms aerate the earth and how, without them, everything dies slower. I saw her eyes soften. Her questions got quieter, less formal. She didn't just see the barn. She saw the heart beating inside it. When the article ran, it included 3 photos and a quote I hadn't realized she'd written down. Sometimes all a child needs is someone to say, I see how your mind works and I think it's beautiful. That was the moment SparkLab stopped being a secret. Within a week, I had 7 new voicemails. 3 from parents, 2 from teachers, 1 from a retired chemist, and 1 from someone organizing a small regional STEM conference in the next county over. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak. Not as a scientist, not even as a teacher, but as someone who had built something where curiosity could breathe. I stared at the email invite for an hour before replying. Yes, 1 word. I didn't know what I would say. I just knew I had something worth sharing. The conference wasn't huge. Maybe 70 people, folding chairs, fluorescent lights, the kind of place where plastic name tags stick awkwardly to your chest. When they called my name, I walked to the front with shaking hands. But the moment I started talking about the soil, the kids, the moment Marcus saw microbial life move for the first time and whispered, "It's alive," my voice steadied. I spoke not from notes, but from memory, from feeling. And when I finished, the room was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from politeness, the kind that comes from recognition. Afterward, a woman approached me. She was a program director from a nearby district. She said, "I've worked in science education for 20 years and I've never seen anything that felt this human." I thanked her, but what I really wanted to say was, this didn't come from a university or a textbook or a foundation grant. It came from a little girl who once felt invisible, who now had a room full of people leaning in, listening, and maybe, for the first time in her life, truly heard. I was cleaning microscope lenses when I saw the car. It didn't belong to anyone from town. Sleek, black, too polished for gravel roads. The kind of car that said, "I'm used to being noticed." The door opened and Gloria stepped out. My sister, hair blown out to perfection, lipstick just right, expensive blazer over tight jeans. She stood there for a second like she wasn't sure the air was clean enough to breathe. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just looked at the barn, then slowly made her way up the path. I didn't move. She stopped just outside the open doors, peering in like she was expecting dust or disappointment. Instead, she saw rows of labeled beakers, trays of seedlings, jars of soil along the shelves, and a dozen colorful drawings taped to the wall. Worms, roots, laughter in crayon. "This is not what I expected," she said finally. I kept polishing the lens. "Hi, Gloria." Her heels clicked against the floor as she stepped in. "I was in the area." I didn't respond. We both knew she wasn't. She walked further in, eyes scanning every detail like she was trying to make sense of it. "I read about you," she said. "You were in the Gazette, then in the Times regional section. You're doing this?" I nodded. "Yes." She touched a microscope just barely. "It's kind of impressive," she admitted. I finally looked at her. Gloria always carried herself like someone who belonged at the center of the room, but today there was something different in her posture, a weight she wasn't used to carrying. "What do you want, Gloria?" She hesitated, then sat down on the edge of a workbench like she was too tired to pretend anymore. "My startup folded," she said. 2 months ago. Investors backed out. The app crashed. Turns out promising too much catches up with you." I waited. She looked at me, and for the first time in years, her voice softened. "I thought I was the one who had it figured out. The house, the title, the press. But I watched your video from that STEM conference, and I realized you've built something that actually means something." The silence between us stretched. Not tense, just full. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim envelope. "It's not a peace offering," she said. "Just something I thought you might want to see." I opened it slowly. Inside was a photo. The 2 of us, maybe 4 and 6, sitting on Grandpa's porch, our faces smeared with mud, holding a potted plant like it was treasure. "I found it in Dad's attic," she said. "Didn't even remember it existed." I stared at it. We looked so free back then, unshaped by competition, untouched by comparison, just sisters. She stood and walked toward the door. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quietly, "but if you ever need help around here, with organizing or outreach or whatever, I'd like to try." I didn't answer right away, but I didn't say no either. As she stepped outside, I called after her. "You were always good at getting people to look. Maybe now you could help them see." She paused, then gave me the smallest smile I'd ever seen from her. But it was real. The door closed behind her and I stood in the silence holding the photo. The past couldn't be rewritten, but maybe, just maybe, it could be added to. 6 years later, the barn was still standing. But now, it was only one part of something much bigger. The land had changed, grown. A gravel path now led to a wide, open plaza paved with stone and edged by native plants and sun-tracking solar lights. Glass buildings stretched low across the property, designed to mirror the landscape instead of conquer it. We called it the Morton Research Campus, and on opening day, I stood beneath a white canvas canopy, surrounded by students, educators, scientists, neighbors, and a few familiar faces from my past. There were folding chairs and a makeshift stage. A banner hung from 2 tall oak trees. Where curiosity grows. I looked around at the people gathering, some with clipboards, others with backpacks or baby strollers, and in the crowd I spotted Jenna, now 17, taller than me, with a sunflower tattoo on her forearm and a full scholarship offer from a top university. She was explaining photosynthesis to a group of 3rd graders using sidewalk chalk and her whole body. I saw Marcus too. He wasn't quiet anymore. He was working part-time in the lab, leading soil restoration workshops for local farmers. His favorite line was still, "Worms do more work than most people realize." Kyle had gone into environmental engineering. Lila had started an outreach program of her own, teaching science in shelters and group homes. They weren't just students anymore. They were stewards. Each of them had taken something from that barn and carried it into the world. And standing beside me that day was Gloria. She didn't wear power suits anymore. She'd traded her heels for sneakers and her PR job for a quiet role coordinating communications for SparkLab. She was the one who made the campus tour videos, who helped parents feel safe leaving their kids in a place that didn't look like a school but taught like one. We didn't talk much about the past anymore. We didn't need to. That morning, before the ribbon cutting, she handed me a note, typed, simple. "This is yours, but I'm proud to be part of it." I folded it and slipped it into my pocket. The ceremony was short. I thanked the donors, the team, the students. I spoke about Grandpa, about soil, about what it meant to build something from what others called waste. I didn't cry until I said the final line. Everything you see here began with one question. What if the invisible is the most important part? When I stepped down from the podium, the applause felt like wind, not forceful, just steady and full. Later, I walked through the new campus alone. There were greenhouses, wet labs, outdoor classrooms, a composting center named after Grandpa, the Harrison Unit. On the far side of the field, tucked behind a row of wildflowers, the original barn still stood. We'd restored it, of course, reinforced the beams, added electricity. But we left the worn floorboards, the old microscope, the photo of me in goggles that still sat above the bench. It wasn't the heart of the place anymore, but it would always be the root, because everything that grew here started there, with a girl no one believed in, and the man who always did. The tour began just after lunch. I walked slowly through the campus with a group of guests, some from the Department of Education, others from local schools, even a representative from a national science foundation. Most were used to marble floors and glass towers. But here, everything was built from wood, earth tones, and light. No sterile white walls, no locked doors. Only curiosity made visible. Each stop told a story. The greenhouse, where students were experimenting with vertical farming using compost generated on-site. The biolab, where Jenna and 2 interns had just published their first co-authored paper on fungal networks. The open-air classroom, where Marcus was explaining erosion by literally pouring water through trays of sand and letting the kids shout predictions. Everyone was engaged, not just listening, leaning in. That was the difference, the real success. I watched their faces as they moved from space to space. There was a kind of collective disbelief, like they were seeing what education could be if it didn't come pre-packaged or standardized. At the last stop, I opened the doors to the central lab. It was the newest building, but designed with Grandpa's old barn in mind. Exposed beams, high ceilings, wide work tables, and windows that looked out on every direction of the property. This was the core, the place where research met story. Where data was captured, but so was wonder. A small group of students were working in silence at one of the back tables, measuring microbial activity in soil samples taken from plots across 3 counties. I saw charts, color-coded notes, a microscope open to a slide labeled Sample 7B Reclaimed Site. One of the girls looked up and waved. "Hey, Dr. Morton," she said. I still wasn't used to being called that. I smiled. "Anything interesting?" She nodded, her face glowing. Plot 7b is showing carbon increase, like a real one. I nodded. That's great. The guests wandered, taking notes, snapping photos. Some of them asked questions. Others just walked in quiet circles, like they didn't want to break the spell. Toward the end, one woman pulled me aside. She wore a long navy coat, glasses perched on her nose, a name tag that read Eleanor Reese National STEM Collaborative. She didn't smile much, but her voice was kind. I've visited dozens of centers like this, she said. But there's something here that I don't usually see. I waited. She gestured toward the lab. Heart, she said. This place has heart. I felt the words settle deep in my chest. Not intelligence, not prestige, heart. That night, after the guests had gone and the lights were low, I returned to the main lab. The campus was quiet now, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I walked to the far corner, where we had set up a small tribute wall. It wasn't fancy, just a photo of Grandpa, a few of his handwritten notes framed, and a single quote etched in wood beneath his image. We don't inherit the earth, we co-create it. I stood there for a long time, then I pulled out the letter he had written me, the one I'd kept folded in my journal all these years. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to, because everything he had hoped I might find, I had found, and I had passed it on. The legacy wasn't the buildings or the grants or the headlines. It was the soil, the spark, the quiet, stubborn belief that someone somewhere might grow into more than they were told they'd be. And I had. Some people say you can't go home again. I used to believe that. But standing at the edge of the outdoor classroom, watching Marcus kneel in the dirt while a group of fourth graders surrounded him, I realized that sometimes home isn't a place. It's a circle. And sometimes, if you're lucky, that circle brings you back to where it all started, this time not as a student, but as someone others look up to. Marcus was explaining worm casting. It's not gross, he told the group, holding up a glass jar of rich, dark compost. It's gold, earth gold. You want healthy tomatoes? Thank a worm. The kids laughed. One girl wrinkled her nose but still reached out to touch the soil. Jenna was nearby, sitting under a shade sail with two high schoolers, analyzing water samples taken from the wetlands restoration plot. She had a clipboard in one hand, a laptop balanced on her knee, and her sunflower tattoo now had roots added to it, stretching down her forearm. She didn't talk much in those early days. Now she led with quiet authority, the kind you couldn't teach in any classroom. Lila was harder to track. She moved between stations, checking in with staff, greeting parents, adjusting lesson plans on the fly. She was always moving, always doing. But every so often she'd pause to crouch next to a child, meet their eyes, and ask a single question that made them stop and think harder. Why do you think that happened? Could something else be going on? What would you try next? They were questions she used to ask me. Now they belonged to her. Watching them work, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not pride. Pride is too small. It was something more like awe, like watching a garden grow wild in the best way, untamed but purposeful. These weren't just students anymore. They were mentors, leaders, builders of something larger than any one of us. One afternoon, after the workshops had ended and most of the kids had gone home, Jenna stayed behind to clean up the lab. She found me stacking trays and handed me a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" I asked. "An invitation," she said. "To our first independent research night, student-led presentations. You're not allowed to take over. Just watch." I smiled. "That'll be hard for me." "I know," she said, teasing. "That's why it's going to be fun." The event was held in the greenhouse, strung with twinkle lights and mismatched chairs. The students presented their findings on everything from soil acidity in schoolyards to the effects of mulching on community gardens. And they didn't just present, they owned it. They spoke with clarity, with confidence. With that spark I had seen so many years ago, flickering, unsure, but now steady and bright. Afterward, Marcus stood up and thanked everyone. Then he turned to me. He didn't make a speech. He just said, "Thanks for not giving up on dirt or on us." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. Sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes the proof is in the people. They were the proof. That healing can ripple. That legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you plant and what grows in others long after you're gone. The campus quieted after sundown. Workshops ended. Kids went home. The hum of conversation faded into the rustle of leaves and the low song of crickets. I waited until it was still. Then I walked back to the barn. It was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had just grown into something bigger. Either way, it didn't matter. That place had never needed size to hold weight. I opened the old door slowly, letting the familiar scent of soil and wood wash over me. The barn had been restored but not remodeled. We kept the creaky floors, the nail heads sticking out of the beams, even the uneven edge on the workbench that Grandpa carved himself when I was 6. The light was soft, just a few string bulbs overhead and the glow from a small lamp near the back wall. I walked to the corner where we had hung a single frame. It wasn't elaborate, just a modest photo of Grandpa Harrison, taken in his early 60s, sleeves rolled up, leaning over a microscope with a faint grin. Beside it, we'd mounted a wooden plaque. Burned into the grain were his words, "We don't inherit the earth, we co-create it." I stood there for a long time. No music, no applause, just the sound of the night pressing gently against the wooden walls. I remembered the first time I walked into this barn after the will was read. Angry, uncertain, alone. That version of me couldn't have imagined this. A campus, a community, a future built from the very thing I was once told had no value. And yet, it wasn't just about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving something to myself, that I didn't have to be handed worth to grow it, that roots, once given space, will find their way to the water. I pulled out my notebook, the same one I had used that first year. Its pages were worn now, corners curled, some ink smudged by rain or tears, but it still held every step, every failure, every fragile beginning. I opened to the last page. There was still space left. Not much, just enough. I wrote, "Legacy isn't what we leave, it's what we seed, what we nurture, what we let others carry forward." I closed the notebook and placed it gently on the workbench beneath his photo. Then I sat. Not to think, not to plan, just to be. The wind slipped through the cracks in the boards, cool against my face. Somewhere outside, I could hear the faint voices of students walking back from the greenhouse, laughter trailing behind them. And I smiled, because even though Grandpa wasn't here, even though he hadn't seen all of this come to life, I knew. He didn't have to. He'd seen enough in me to plant the seed. That was all it ever took. Just one person, one letter, one key, and a door left unlocked. The studio lights were warmer than I expected. Not harsh. Just bright. Like they were trying a little too hard to make everyone look softer, younger, more composed. I sat across from the host in a simple navy dress, hands folded in my lap, a small SparkLab pin on my collar. My name appeared in clean white letters at the bottom of the screen. Isabelle Morton, founder, SparkLab Initiative. The host leaned in, smiling. "So, Isabelle," she began, "you've been called a trailblazer in community-based science education. But you once described yourself as someone who never thought she'd be seen. Tell us about that." I took a slow breath. "I used to think visibility came from being chosen," I said, "from being invited into rooms, from applause, but I've learned that being seen really begins the moment you stop needing permission to exist." She nodded, encouraging. "You've said your project began in an old barn?" I smiled. "Yes, my grandfather's lab. After he passed, he left me a letter. Not with instructions, just with belief. That was the spark. I didn't have a plan. Just a feeling that if I started with the soil, something would grow." The host leaned forward slightly. "What do you say to people who feel invisible now, who haven't yet found their soil, their spark?" I paused. It was the question that always got to me. "I'd say this," I began. "Sometimes the most important work happens long before anyone notices. Sometimes you have to build something in the dark, quietly, alone. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove yourself right." I glanced toward the camera for a moment, not out of performance, but because I knew someone, somewhere, needed to hear this. I spent years trying to earn love I already deserved, trying to be exceptional just to feel enough, and I don't live like that anymore. I create things that matter. I surround myself with people who see value in questions, not just in answers, and that has changed everything. There was a pause in the room. Not scripted, just full. The host eventually smiled. "Well, I think a lot of people needed to hear that today." After the show aired, my inbox filled with messages from teachers, from parents, From grown women who had never stepped into a science lab but now wanted to, and from girls, so many girls, asking if SparkLab had a place for them. It always did, because in the end, this wasn't about me being the face of anything, it was about being the mirror. So someone else could finally see themselves, clearly, maybe for the first time, and know they had always been enough. The rain had just stopped when I stepped into the barn. Everything smelled like wet earth and new beginnings. Inside, the kids were cleaning up from an afternoon lesson on ecosystems. Rain had delayed the compost demo, but no one seemed to mind. They were still buzzing with questions. I walked toward the back where a few of them were stacking trays. That's when I noticed her. A little girl, maybe 7, sitting cross-legged on the floor near the microscope table, holding a handful of soil like it was a secret. She looked up when I approached. "You okay?" I asked gently. She nodded, then paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She held up the dirt in her palm and looked at it like it might answer first. Why can the ground fix itself when it's broken, but people can't? The room around us faded for a moment, just the two of us. Her question hung in the air like something holy. I crouched down beside her and didn't rush to answer. "Well," I said, "that's a really smart question." She shrugged, still staring at her palm. I looked at the soil she was holding, dark, moist, teeming with things she couldn't see. "You know," I began, "the ground doesn't fix itself by magic. It heals because there are living things inside it. Tiny things, working together, breaking down what's old, turning it into something new. It takes time, and the right conditions." She furrowed her brow, still thinking. "And people?" I smiled gently. "People are kind of the same. We break sometimes, get hurt, get ignored, but if we're given the right space and the right care, we can grow back too. Maybe not the same, but sometimes even stronger." She looked at her palm again, then closed her fingers slowly over the dirt. "Okay," she said, like she had decided to believe me. I stood and helped her up, brushing the soil from her jeans. "What's your name?" I asked. "Maya." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a tiny envelope. Inside was a single sunflower seed. "I want you to take this," I said. "Plant it somewhere, watch what happens, but more important than what you see, pay attention to what it teaches you." She took the seed like it was treasure, and I knew she would. Later that night, I wrote about her in my journal, not by name, just by spirit, because she reminded me of a girl I used to be, quiet, curious, searching for someone to answer her questions with care, not impatience. Maya may never know how much her question meant, but I'll remember it forever, because it wasn't really about dirt. It was about hope, and how, when planted right, it grows in the most unexpected places. The barn was quiet again. The kids had gone, the tools were cleaned, the sunlight stretched long across the floorboards, casting golden stripes through the slats in the walls. I stood alone near the doorway, watching the wind ripple through the tall grass outside. The land didn't look extraordinary, but I knew better now. What grows beneath the surface is always more powerful than what shows above it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded letter I'd carried for years, the one Grandpa wrote me, the one that started it all. I didn't open it. I didn't need to, because his voice was in the trees now, in the footsteps of every child who passed through this place, in the questions that hung in the air like seeds looking for a place to land. I walked to the old workbench, the same one I'd cleared off all those years ago when I didn't know what I was doing. I ran my fingers along the edge, now smoothed from years of hands leaning on it, learning, and I spoke. Not aloud, but from somewhere deep inside. They told me I wasn't enough, that I was too quiet, too odd, too soft. They said I didn't belong, that I didn't deserve anything simply because I didn't shine the way they wanted me to. But now I understand something I didn't back then. You don't have to shine to be seen. You don't have to fight for space that was never meant to hold you. You can build your own place, plant your own garden, write your own name on the door. I'm not angry anymore. Not at my parents. Not even at who I used to be. I've stopped waiting to be recognized. I've stopped trying to win approval that never mattered in the first place, because I've created something better than applause. I've created something that lives. A room where questions are sacred. A garden where no one is turned away. A legacy that grows from the ground up. And maybe most of all, I've created a version of myself that I'm proud of. Not polished, not perfect, but real. Capable of growing. capable of healing, and capable of turning silence into something that speaks. So if you're listening, and you've ever felt small, forgotten, unseen, this is for you. The soil remembers. The seed doesn't care who doubts it, and you are allowed to begin again. You always were. That's what legacy really is. Not the wealth we leave behind, but the courage we pass on, the spaces we open, the light we carry forward, even when no one's watching. And one day, someone will walk through a door you left open, and they'll say, "This is where it started. This is where I found my spark." And that will be enough. It always was. The first time someone called me a legacy, I laughed. It was after a panel discussion at a small education conference. A college student, maybe 19 or 20, walked up to me holding a notebook covered in soil smudges and marker doodles. Her voice was shaking just a little when she spoke. "Thank you," she said. "You're the kind of legacy I want to be." I smiled politely, thinking it was just something people said, but that night the words stayed with me. Legacy, not success, not fame, not even impact. Legacy. It sounded like something carved in marble, reserved for people with foundations named after them, or statues in city parks. Not someone who used to cry in a barn full of broken beakers and unanswered questions. But maybe that's the point. Maybe legacy isn't what others give you. Maybe it's what grows from the moments when no one's watching. When you choose to stay curious in a world that tells you to conform. When you show up for the kids no one expects anything from. When you keep building, even if the people who hurt you never say they're sorry. That night I pulled out the old photo again, the one of me and Gloria as little girls on Grandpa's porch. Mud on our faces, potted plant between us. Pure joy. We didn't know then what would come between us. We just knew we loved dirt and each other, in the way only children can, without condition. I placed that photo next to another one, taken just a month ago, of Gloria and me standing outside the new SparkLab greenhouse, arms slung around each other's shoulders. She was laughing. Not posed, not perfect, but real. I didn't think forgiveness would look like that. But sometimes healing doesn't arrive in a big speech or dramatic moment. Sometimes it shows up quietly, through time. Through showing up again and again until one day you realize the hurt doesn't live in your body the way it used to. I sat at my desk, journal open, the lamplight soft around me. I didn't write a list of accomplishments. I didn't tally up numbers. I wrote one sentence. I have become the person I needed when I was 10, and I let that be enough. Because that's what legacy really is. Becoming the person who turns silence into safety, loneliness into learning, and pain into possibility. That's not something you inherit. That's something you create. The seasons in Rose Hill move slower than in the city. You notice the change in the soil first, the way it loosens after a hard winter, the way it darkens just before the rain. And then come the birds, the bees, the children with muddy shoes and wide eyes, asking questions that stop you in your tracks. It was a Thursday afternoon when I saw Maya again. She was taller now. Still had that same quiet curiosity, but her eyes were steadier, like she had begun to trust her place in the world. She walked up to me after her group's final presentation on pollination systems. Her hands were still covered in pen ink and leaf dust. "I wanted to show you something," she said. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a notebook. Worn edges, stickers peeling at the corners. Inside were pages filled with sketches, data tables, taped leaves, questions in bright-colored markers. But what caught my eye was the first page. It said in her careful handwriting, "SparkLab is where I found my roots." I looked up at her, heart caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. She shrugged, suddenly shy. "It's kind of cheesy, I know." "It's beautiful," I said. And I meant it. We stood there for a while, just breathing in the spring air, listening to the buzz of the greenhouse behind us. She asked, "Do you think things ever really heal? Or do we just grow around the broken parts?" I smiled. "Both," I said. "Some parts heal, some stay a little cracked. But growth doesn't ask for perfection, it just asks for room." She nodded like she understood that better than most adults I know. Before she left, she reached into her pocket and handed me something small. It was a sunflower seed. "Your turn," she said. I held it between my fingers, warm from her hand. "Where should I plant it?" I asked. She smiled. "Where you need it most." And with that, she was gone. I stayed there long after the others had gone home, seed still in my palm, the wind rustling through the tall grass like a soft reminder. There's always more to grow, always more to give. And sometimes, the greatest thing you can pass on isn't knowledge or tools or buildings. It's the belief that someone's voice matters, that someone's questions are worth answering, that someone's presence, not their performance, is enough. That's how you break the cycle. That's how you plant a new one. And just like that, the girl who once walked away from her family with nothing in her hands now held a single seed, and everything it meant. They told me legacy was about what you leave behind, a name, a fortune, a plaque on the wall. But I've come to learn, legacy isn't what's carved in stone. It's what you plant in others. What grows when you're no longer in the room. It's the quiet decision to begin, even when no one believes in you. It's the letter that says, I see you. It's the room you build for those who've been told they don't belong. The truth is, you don't have to inherit greatness. You can grow it. In the soil, in your story, in your silence. So if you're listening to this and thinking, that's me, I've been overlooked, I've been pushed aside, then I want to tell you, this story is yours too. You are allowed to start again. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to rewrite what you were taught about your worth. And maybe, just maybe, you are the beginning of a new kind of legacy. One that doesn't ask for applause, just light and patience and the courage to keep growing. Because when you choose to grow anyway, that's when the story begins. Now, if this touched something in you, I invite you to reflect. Where can you plant your seed? Whose voice can you help amplify? What space can you open for someone else? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, your story matters. Always has.